It's great to be here. I'm really delighted at the opportunity to get to talk to you this morning. In late 2014, I was trying to figure out what was going to come next in my life. And I had recently finished grad school in Ireland, where I was studying conflict resolution and reconciliation. And I'd come back to where I was living in Nashville. I knew I had a passion for two things, really, storytelling and peace building. And I really wanted to find a way that I could bring those two things together. And so I was overjoyed when I actually stumbled across a new Fulbright program in collaboration with National Geographic in digital storytelling. Dream come true. So I spent weeks preparing my application, getting quality references, writing my project proposal, all the things that you have to do. And one day I was sitting at a Starbucks off White Bridge Road and an email arrived from Fulbright and I had made it into the final 10. So the project that I had proposed was this. It was going to be a fully funded 9-month sojourn through Israel and Palestine, Northern Ireland, and South Africa. I wanted to gather stories of people who had lived their lives in divided societies and were trying to find a way to build a better future by learning to exist beside their enemies without violence. My hunch was that their stories could offer some kind of wisdom to our divisions here in the U.S. So the 2 weeks that followed that email were absolutely agonizing. Every day I was obsessively checking my email, feeling like my entire future was hanging in the balance. And then finally the next email came and I was out. The Fulbright dream was not going to happen. And I was gutted for days, really weeks if I'm honest. But I remembered that a Texas university that I'd spoken at probably 4 or 5 months before had expressed some interest in following my trip if I got the Fulbright. So I called him up and I told him, hey, I didn't get it. But I said to him, can I tell you what I was imagining? And I painted them this picture, narrating the types of stories I knew I could find and the impact that those stories could have on their university students. Because I wanted them not only to see the project in their mind, but to feel the power that it could hold. And then I crossed my fingers and I said, would you all have any interest in funding this yourselves? And they said, yes. And 4 months later, I boarded a plane for Tel Aviv, launching a journey that would eventually lead to my 2020 publication, I Am Not Your Enemy, which, as Harris said, won an award that he's deeply envious about. When I sat down to write I Am Not Your Enemy, I pulled out the statement of purpose that I had written for the Fulbright application. And there was one sentence in particular that caught my eye. The stories we tell directly affect the breadth of our imagination. And I'm not going to lie, I definitely thought to myself, that's pretty good. Not good because it was particularly beautifully written, but good because it felt so true. It was a truth that had been made clear to me in my studying of history in college some years before. And I remember when I was in a class called Religion and American Culture, and I had read about the unbelievable example of the Amish community of Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania. Some of you may remember this story. It was October of 2006 when they endured an absolute horror. A local milkman walked into the one-room schoolhouse of their community in Nickel Mines, locked the doors, and murdered 5 of their children before he killed himself. And yet the Amish families did not react the way any of us might have expected. They did something extraordinary. They offered forgiveness to the widow of the man that killed their children. They gave her a significant portion of all of the financial aid that was pouring in from around the world. And the one that I think astounds me the most is that they attended the man's funeral. I cannot fathom attending the funeral of the person that would murder my son. And so I wondered, probably a lot like you all are wondering now, how is this actually possible? How could somebody act in that way to that kind of tragedy? And so for some insight, I think we have to look to the stories that formed their lives. In school, the Amish don't study the histories of war like I did in my history degree, where we're learning about the American Civil War or Revolutionary War. They learn actually about the stories of Christian martyrs, people who gave up their lives in service of their faith and in a commitment to love their enemies. Like one of the stories that I always remember is the story of Dirk Willems, a 16th century Christian who was imprisoned for his faith and escaped, and he fled across an icy pond as one of the guards was chasing him. But the guard fell through the ice and he cried out for help and Dirk chose to go back and save him. And that decision to rescue his enemy actually led to Dirk's recapture and his death at the stake. But the message was really clear. Holy Christian living was found not in self-preservation, but in a selfless love of enemies. And so it was those kinds of stories that were populating the imagination of the Amish that allowed them to know that a better future was possible than one of vengeance and of retribution. My guess is that most of you who are listening right now are not dealing with these kinds of tragedies. I hope that you're not. But if you are part of an organization, then you are part of an organization that at one point imagined something could be different. Why would your work exist if not because someone believed that something better was needed? Organizations are launched by imagination. But so often our organizations stop dreaming. We begin to just kind of putter along in this rut of maintenance mode, just keeping things going. And that rich, imaginative work that kind of catapulted us into the world is relegated to, at best, the origin story that we occasionally tell, and at worst, this kind of footnote memory about the people that were dreaming a long time ago. But here today, we're circling a different idea, the idea of a better future. And it strikes me that living is really a desperate hope that our futures are going to be better than our presents and our pasts. Like, why would we really keep at it day after day if some part of us didn't believe that the best is still to come? But the question is, like, what does this better future look like? What does that even mean? Who has what in the better future? Where does the power lie? What was lost to bring about the better future? Who was lost? And who has a voice in saying what better even is? And for me, like, these questions are part of the vocabulary of imagination. Every peace builder that I've ever met or learned about was a dreamer. And today I want to share with you 3 key learnings that peace building, I think, has to offer us. I've been really lucky to work closely with remarkable peace builders. I've traveled through many divided societies. I've written, studied, and taught on the principles and the practices of building peace. And I think these lessons are applicable to anyone, no matter what field that you work in. And so the first piece of learning I want to share is this. Better futures begin with bold imaginations. Think about Dr. King. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. knew a thing or two about the imagination. In fact, the speech that I'm sure many of us can quote, his most famous speech, is this kind of impassioned prayer of the imagination. And he said, "I have a dream." And as we all know, he wasn't this kind of pie in the sky dreamer. You know, his dream, peace builders' dreams are all, of these better futures are ones that spring up from the concrete chaos of the things that are broken right now. And peace building has always been, and it has to always be, a project of a courageous imagination. You know, it's a project that is fueled by those 2 world-building words that Harris mentioned before. What if? So one man that asked that question was the Israeli journalist Meron Rapaport. I've been traveling to Israel and Palestine since I was 10 years old, and I've made over a dozen trips since then. This is me sitting on the Mount of Olives in front of Jerusalem with the Dome of the Rock behind. And throughout the decades, Meron's name has popped up here and there, most notably because of this fascinating peace movement that he co-founded called A Land for All. And while the movement itself really does fill me with hope, for a long time, what I've really wanted to know is, like, what's the origin story? How did this all start? And so 2 weeks ago, I finally did the obvious, and I wrote to Meron and said, "Can I talk to you?" And bless his soul, he said, "Sure." And so over Zoom last week, I actually got to have a conversation with him, and he told me how all of this started. So it was 2011 when the wildfire of the Arab Spring was spreading all across the Middle East. And in his home city of Tel Aviv in Israel, Meron was listening to the cries of the protesters down in the city center. They were calling for equal rights for Palestinians. Meron himself had spent 3 years in the Israeli army. He had lived his entire life in Israel, surrounded by all of the violence that has plagued that region for so long. And so he was familiar with all of the failed attempts at peace agreements that have happened. And that list is really, 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 really long. And he knew that what almost all of them had in common was this idea that there should be 2 separate states, Israel and Palestine, with set, secure, shut borders, each people in their own countries. But Meron had a different idea. He thought, what if Israelis and Palestinians could truly share the land? And so throughout the next year, he started talking to all kinds of friends about what he called the practical utopia. And one friend said, "I have someone that you need to meet. He's a Palestinian, and his name is Auni al-Mashni." So Meron told me that Alni was actually raised in a Palestinian refugee camp, and he spent 12 traumatizing years in Israeli prison for political organizing in the 1980s. And yet Meron's friend told him that Alni had an open mind and that the future that Alni was imagining, even after all he had been through, was so similar to what Meron was describing. So they arranged a meeting at their mutual friend's kind of 8th-story news office building in Bethlehem. It was on in a stone building on this really high hill overlooking the area. Meron said that the room was filled with smoke when he arrived as Alni was lighting up cigarette after cigarette. And as soon as they started talking, Meron could feel a spark. He said their visions were completely in sync. They were dreaming of 2 sovereign states, yes, but with open borders, not closed borders, and freedom of movement where people could live wherever they wanted. They'd have shared core institutions. Jerusalem would be a shared city, and the past injustices that they have suffered would be addressed without creating new ones. And so in this first conversation, Meron said there was actually no arguing. There was no conflict. There was no negotiating or debating. There was only imagination and cigarettes and coffee. And from that 8th-story window, they could look out on the ancient hills of Bethlehem and Jerusalem. I've had a lot of fortune over the years to get to travel to that land, and I've driven all over those hills. And in reality, there's actually a 25-foot wall that Israel has built that separates these cities from each other. But Meron said from the office window that day, they couldn't actually see it. They couldn't easily tell which neighborhoods were Palestinian and which were Jewish. There was no visible separation. It all looked like the future that they were imagining, an actual shared land for everyone. And so from that meeting, their movement was born. So better futures begin with bold imaginations. And I think these imaginations come to life through stories. I have a delightful job of getting to work with organizations around the world to help them find, develop, and tell their most meaningful stories, whether that's a tech company looking for help finding their stories of innovation, or maybe nonprofits wanting to tell stories of their social impact. And I get to do a lot of this work alongside my friend David Hutchins, who you're going to hear from really soon in our program called The Storytelling Leader. And we've really been surprised quite often at how many organizations are not actually telling stories about what they do. Because storytelling is perhaps our most powerful resource in the work that we do. There's research actually that suggests that our capacity to remember something increases by 22 times when we learn it through a story rather than learning it through explanation. And it's because our brains are evolutionarily wired for story. But we so often don't utilize this hardwired technology to kind of move the work that we care about forward. And so when it comes to organizational storytelling, one of the essential stories David and I always encourage groups to be telling is the vision story. We call this the imagine a world story, or the what if we had that here story. And when we work with these organizations, we try to draw their attention to a fact of nature that we think is really relevant to this conversation. And that's called heliotropism, the idea that plants grow toward the light, always. And as David Cooperrider talks about in The Theory of Appreciative Inquiry, organizations, movements, people, we're the same as plants. We grow toward those positive images and those positive stories that we put in front of us. So if we want to manifest that better future that we're imagining, we have to tell stories about it. And so this is the second piece of learning. Vision stories are blueprints of the future. So I want to circle back then to Meron and Alni. Meron told me that Alni is currently up to something really interesting. Alni knows that the ideas and the principles of their movement, this Land for All movement, are not actually what's going to get them across the finish line. So he knows that they're going to have to begin to story the future that they're dreaming of. And so actually right now, as we speak, Alni is finishing writing a novel. And in this novel, 2 men, Alni and Meron, journey from the time that they're living in now to the future, where this whole vision that they've been talking about, a land for all, is now actually a reality. And they walk around in this future and they see it and they hear it and they touch it, they smell it, they breathe it in, they have conversations. They get to see how all of it is playing out. And then they come back to the present, to the place that they began, so that they can begin to take the necessary steps to lead their people to that future. And Alni said that he intends to publish this novel in Arabic, Hebrew, and English so that everyone in Israel and Palestine can read it. I love so much that Alni is doing this because our imaginations are so important to get us going, But we are not going to be able to build the better future that we're imagining if we only stay up here in our heads, right? We are going to need our hearts too. And that's why we need the stories, because the stories let us feel the future. They're like the OG virtual reality tech. When our brains lock in on a story, it is neurologically as if that story is happening to us. Right? This is why you jump in your seat during a scary movie, even though it's not real, or you find yourselves yelling at the characters in a TV show that are wrecking their love lives. Come on, Ross and Rachel, figure it out. You know, the brain doesn't actually interpret the difference between the story that you're watching and the story that you're experiencing. So if you want the future to feel possible, to feel real, we have to put it in a story. So when it comes to peace builders, storytelling has always played a really central role, and not just in this idea of projecting and imagining the future. But I think even more so for peace builders, where storytelling has come in is the need to excavate the truth of where we've been and who we are now. And for people in conflict, there's really no hope of ever reconciling without some kind of honest reckoning with not just the stories of your enemy, the stories of the other, but also the stories about yourself. So this is then the third and final piece of learning. We cannot craft true stories of what comes next until we own the stories of what is now. I didn't tell you yet, but there's actually a little bit more to Auni's time travel novel. The second part of it narrates the journeys that led Meron and Auni to the precise moment that they're living in now. Because I think Auni also knows that true stories about the future are going to need honest ones about the present. We have to pause and take stock before we go jumping off the cliff. When I was living in Belfast for grad school, one of the classes that I got to take was in strategic peace building. And the professor, who was a peace builder herself, told us that every peace building movement that she knows of that was effective at some point came together to cast a clear vision of a better future that they wanted and to answer three core questions. The first, what do we already have that will help us bring this future to fruition? What do we not yet have that we're going to need, and who can help us? And third, how will we navigate the complicated terrain of change, and what can we hold to that might steady us along the way? When I think of this last question, the idea of navigating the complicated terrain of change and finding something to hold us steady, there's another story that comes to my mind, and it's the last one that I want to tell you before I finish. It's also about another Israeli and a Palestinian. These two are Rami El-Hanan and Bassam Aramin. Rami is a former Israeli soldier, and his father actually made it out of the Auschwitz death camp in Europe during the Holocaust. But his daughter Smedar did not make it to the age of 14, because she was murdered in Jerusalem by a Palestinian suicide bomber in 1997. Bassam is a former Palestinian political prisoner whose daughter Abir was shot in the back of the head by an Israeli soldier in 2007, murdered on her way home from school. Candy was still in her pocket from the store that she had just walked out of, and she was 10 years old. I got to sit with them both a few years ago when I was working on I Am Not Your Enemy. I tell their story in the last chapter of the book. And I sat with them in Bethlehem, and I can still remember seeing the grief that was in their eyes, even this, 10, 15 years later. They told me their stories of loss as, this is what they do. So they go around telling these stories, and they had done that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. And yet, when I was listening to them, I could tell that they hadn't grown numb to it, right? There was still so much pain for them in that story. And there was also still so much love, and you could see it in the smile that they had on their faces when they talked about their daughters. So when they lost their daughters, the grief that they had could have become a weapon. I remember Rami saying that it was like a nuclear energy. And it does become a weapon for so many people. But Rami and Bassam imagined, and continue to imagine today, that a different future is actually possible than one with more bloodshed. And so for years, Rami and Bassam led a group called the Parents Circle, an organization of Israelis and Palestinians that are bereaved, that are doing everything that they can to save other families from having to experience that agony of burying your loved ones, of burying your children. So as Rami told me in that conversation, he said, "We are not doomed. This is not our destiny to keep killing each other in this holy land of ours forever. We can change it." And when I sat with Rami and Bassam that day, it was so obvious to me that they've become more than just friends, that they are now today like brothers. In fact, when Bassam's daughter, Abir, actually drew her last breath in that Jerusalem hospital back in 2007, she had been killed by the Israeli soldier. It was actually Rami, a former Israeli soldier himself, who stayed with Bassam and his wife and wept with him through the night for the daughter that they just lost. The better future that they're imagining is one they are practicing now. And what better way is there to write a story of the future than to live the future story in the present? So today I'm going to ask you, what is your story of a better future? And what if you started living it now? Thank you very much.
And so good, so good. Thank you
Thanks
so much for sharing that amazing stuff with us. You asked a lot of really big questions in there that I was watching the chat while you were speaking, and there was lots of like, slow down, please. It's going way too fast. Like I can't type. And so don't worry. All of Michael's content is going to be in some of the worksheets that we're creating for you in real time. There's also people saying like, oh man, like this is so polished and he's so good, like this has to be pre-recorded. And so we're here live in a studio, folks. None of this is pre-recorded. You're gonna see everything today across the spectrum as part of just producing a live event. But man, thank you. There's so much wisdom in this, and we're always talking, I'm always talking about what you're saying is so true, and our imaginations are so powerful that those visions that we create for the future, they end up being created. The negative, not so hopeful visions for the future also end up being created, right?
That's right, yeah.
And so that worry, that anxiety, that worry is a misuse of imagination. I think we're capable of using them for so much more.
And I think that idea of heliotropism, the idea that we grow toward the better images, the reverse is also true. If we continue to put out those negative and harmful and dark stories and images, that we will begin to disintegrate toward that as well. And so I think it is so important to be really selective in the stories that we're putting out in front of us.
Yeah. Such a powerful reminder. Thank you again,
Thanks.
Michael McRay, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you all.
Appreciate it, man.